We begin tonight with the death of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, who passed away Friday at the age of 95 in Singapore, where he had long received medical treatment. Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa announced his predecessor's death on his official Twitter account, calling Mugabe an icon of liberation, a Pan-Africanist who dedicated his life to the emancipation of and empowerment of his people. Mnangagwa said Mugabe's contribution to the history of Zimbabwe and the continent will never be forgotten. Mugabe was initially hailed as a liberator of his country. However, later in life, he was often criticized for human rights abuses that included the beatings, torture, and killings of his political rivals. Western countries imposed sanctions on Mugabe and his allies after his supporters began seizing white-owned farmland in 2000. Zimbabwe's farm output and economy plummeted when the land was given to blacks who had little experience in large-scale farming. The African National Congress has issued a statement mourning the death of Mugabe, saying he came to epitomize the new African who, having shrugged off the colonial yoke, would strive to ensure his country took its rightful place among the community of nations, firmly in charge of its own destiny. Mugabe, who ruled Zimbabwe for 37 years following the end of white minority rule in 1980, is hailed by some as a liberation icon, but others say he destroyed the economy of what was once Africa's breadbasket while rigging elections and terrorizing his people for decades. VOA's Anita Paul reviews Mugabe's life and legacy.
To the very end. Robert Mugabe was the first president of modern Zimbabwe and leaves a complicated legacy after 37 years of increasingly autocratic rule. His longtime deputy, Emmerson Mnangagwa, forced him to resign in 2017 and took his place, but never sought to punish him.
Is the founding father of the nation of Zimbabwe.
In 2018, for the first time in decades, millions of Zimbabweans cast their ballots in a poll that did not feature Mugabe. He was among those voters. But the notoriously sharp-tongued leader did not go quietly into retirement.
I fooled into believing that all is well. No, it was not a coup d'etat. Nonsense. It was a thorough coup d'etat.
He defended his legacy.
I have, during that time, during all this time, cried for our return to constitutionality, our return to legality, our return to freedom for our people, an environment in which our people would be free.
Many Zimbabweans, many of whom were born after he came to power in 1980, say the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Robert Mugabe was right at first, but somehow he went wrong.
The dashing, eloquent guerrilla fighter negotiated Zimbabwe's independence from Britain in 1979. Early on, he urged Zimbabweans to reconcile after the 15-year civil war that brought about independence. He also initially expanded the education and health systems, making them among the best regarded in Africa. But as time went on, he became more controlling and faced increasing allegations of human rights abuses, repression, and election rigging. The economy collapsed after he led a far-reaching land expropriation program, and both inflation and unemployment soared. But even as he cast his final ballot, he was warmly welcomed by his people, who cheered the man they call by his clan name, Kushungo. Mugabe will be buried at Harare's Heroes Acre Cemetery, his final resting place overlooking a country that, for decades, was inseparable from the man at the top.
Let's listen now to some notable quotes from Robert Mugabe.
There will never be a regime change here. There will always be the people of Zimbabwe in control.
And when I look back, I say, oh Lord, why were these taken before me? And why have I remained so long alone and alive? I cannot answer that.
Now, for more on the life and times of Robert Mugabe, VOA Southern Africa correspondent Anita Paul joins me live via Skype from Maputo, Mozambique. Good evening, Anita. Now, Robert Mugabe has been described in various ways as an autocrat, a liberator. How is he being remembered?
I think his legacy ultimately is going to be a very mixed one. We're already seeing on social media, which is, of course, no place for civility, we're already seeing very wildly differing views on the first leader of independent Zimbabwe, that he was, some people say, in his early days, a liberator, a lion of Africa, and then sunk to be a greedy, corrupt kleptocrat in his later days. So I think ultimately Robert Mugabe will be a mixed bag, and his legacy will be a mixed bag as well.
Now, Anita, the current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, is also eulogizing Mugabe with very great words of respect, yet Mugabe maintained that he was ousted, he was overthrown in a de facto military coup, part of which how Mnangagwa got into power. How are people reacting to Mnangagwa's statements?
I think many Zimbabweans understand that this is strategic for Emmerson Mnangagwa. He's been very consistent on this point, stressing that Mugabe should be respected, that he's the father of the nation. And that is for one reason, and one reason alone. It's because Mnangagwa needs that legitimacy. If he agrees that Mugabe was a despot and a tyrant and needed to be overthrown, then that makes his rule by effect illegitimate. So it's very important that he smooth this over. I think this is a critical juncture, actually, for Emmerson Mnangagwa to keep the peace in Zimbabwe and kind of cement his legacy as a leader who's going to move Zimbabwe forward and conveniently just kind of forget about this 37-year blip in Zimbabwean history and kind of paint it in a very rosy shade. Because otherwise, if he does give sharp words on the legacy of Robert Mugabe, then it just makes it look like what Mugabe said it was, which was, according to Mugabe, a coup.
Now, if you can summarize in 30 seconds the controversial kind of relationship between him and his opposition, his opponent, Morgan Tsvangirai, how would you describe that? Because they finally came together, but it was really thorny.
It was a problematic marriage when they came together for this coalition government, I believe in 2009, after disputed violent elections. In some ways, some people say that that actually is what eroded Tsvangirai's life, that the stress of it maybe exacerbated his already poor health. And in a way, it might have actually bolstered Mugabe and weakened Tsvangirai, which is a sad end for a leader like Tsvangirai, who was so beloved in Zimbabwe that people called him by his first name, Morgan. And so you have two very, very different men. And it's interesting that Tsvangirai died a year ago, well before Mugabe at a much younger age. But they were true rivals, but they did try to put a good face on it. And in the end, here we are. They're both now no longer with us.
Yes, Anita, thank you so much. VOA's Anita Paul reporting live via Skype from Maputo, Mozambique. Now, reaction to the death of Mugabe has been swift on Friday. In Harare, on the streets bearing his name, Rosemary Moyo spoke about one of Africa's most polarizing leaders.
I think President Mugabe was a leader. Yeah, since he was voted to be the president of Zimbabwe, he led Zimbabwe in a right way. We will say, may his soul rest in peace. He was someone who was a man of his words. He could do the right thing. Although in some things he did the things not in a good way. Like the land reform program, to me, it wasn't a good thing.
Some Zimbabweans living in South Africa had different views of Zimbabwe's longtime leader.
He was just a bad leader. He was an all-around just bad leader. So I don't know how to feel about his person. I mean, at the end of the day, he was still human. You have to respect that fact. But yeah, I don't know how to feel about his person at all.
Now, the African Union ambassador to the United States, Arikana Chihombori Kwao, told VOA Friday that Mugabe was, quote, a man who stood for truth and what was right, and that he stuck to his principle to ensure that black Zimbabweans had access to land. For more perspective on the passing of Robert Mugabe, I'm joined by VOA Zimbabwe reporter Gibbs Dube. Gibbs, welcome back to Africa 54.
Thank you so much.
Now, first of all, you've spoken to a lot of Zimbabweans since this happened. The news broke late in the night here in DC, but in Zimbabwe, they have reacted. What are they telling you?
Now, it appears as if it's a mixed bag. You know, there are some people who really loved the man. They loved the man for many things. One of them is education. They're saying it did very well. You still remember that at one stage, Zimbabwe had a very high literacy rate compared to other African countries. So they are praising him for that. Then there are some who are saying, well, people were educated, but what has happened to their education since now they are suffering? At the same time, with some other people who actually were given land, you know, there was this kind of agrarian reforms, which was something that maybe some people were not waiting for until,
yes, and a lot of people think that's where Zimbabwe went wrong. It used to be the breadbasket of the region, but after the land reforms that pitted the white farmers who knew how to till the land, the huge, you know, pieces of land, and gave them to the black people. And then there was all these issues. Some people say that was the basis and the genesis of Zimbabwe's becoming so poor to what the extent to which we see Zimbabwe.
It really started in 1997 when the former president, the late Robert Mugabe, actually gave some war veterans, 30,000 of them, $50,000 each, you know, as a way of saying, you know, quelling them. They were actually making a lot of noise. Some of them were very poor and so forth. And at the same time, he was engaged in the DRC war. So that actually brought the country down. So it was a time when the country was engaged in certain economic policies like ESAP. And so it didn't go down very well. And then when he embarked on the land reform program, it became worse. You know, and he was parceling land to his friends.
Now, in a very few seconds, what is being planned for his funeral?
In terms of his funeral, we are told that, you know, the Politburo of the ruling ZANU-PF party is going to hold a meeting and they're going to debate on what is supposed to be done. But it's known that Mugabe is a hero to the ruling ZANU-PF party, even if he was removed from power through a de facto military coup.
Yes.
So maybe they are going to discuss that, but the problem is Mr. Mugabe's relatives don't want him to be buried at the National Heroes Acre.
There's a bit of controversy. Gibbs,
Yes.
thank you very much. We appreciate your insight into this.
Thank you.
All right. Gibbs Dube is a VOA Zimbabwe service reporter, and we'll be right back.